April 26, 1986, 1:23:58 a.m. Unit 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant explodes twice. The first explosion is steam. The second is presumably thermal. The reactor's 200-ton lid blows off like a cork. More than 7 tons of nuclear fuel and graphite are released into the atmosphere. The temperature in the core is 3,000 degrees Celsius, higher than the melting point of most metals on Earth. A column of radioactive smoke and steam rises several kilometers into the sky. It glows with a bluish light. The first firefighters to arrive see this light and think it's beautiful. They don't yet know what it means. They don't know they're looking at ionizing radiation so intense that some of them will survive less than a month. They stand on the roof of the turbine hall next to the burning graphite of the reactor core and don't know that they are already dead. 3 kilometers from the reactor, the city of Pripyat sleeps. 49,000 people. The average age is 26. The youngest city in the Soviet Union, founded in 1970 as a town near the nuclear power plant. Clean streets, new houses, the Rabashi department store, the energetic palace of culture, a swimming pool, an amusement park with a Ferris wheel and go-karts that were scheduled to open on May 1st, in 5 days. A city that was 16 years old and had not yet had time to age. That night, most of its residents slept. Those who were awake saw a flash from a window, heard an explosion, decided something was wrong at the plant. It happens. They fell asleep again. They didn't know they had lived through the most terrible night in the history of peaceful nuclear energy, and they didn't know that this was only the beginning. April 26th, Friday morning. A workday. Children go to school. Workers go to their shifts, including to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant itself, to the other units that continued to operate. In the air, something invisible, imperceptible, intangible, odorless, colorless, tasteless. Radiation gives no warning. It's simply there. Fragments of graphite, ejected from the reactor core, lie on the pavement, grayish-black, like broken bricks. Children kick them. The dosimetrists who went to the site measured radiation levels, and their instruments went off scale because they were designed for a maximum of 3 or 4 milliroentgens per hour. The actual level in some spots reached thousands and tens of thousands. The instruments showed the maximum scale and went silent. This could be interpreted in 2 ways. Either there was no radiation, or there was so much that the instruments couldn't handle it. The correct answer was the second. That same morning, a wedding was taking place in Pripyat. It was young firefighter Vasily Ignatenko and his fiancée, Lyudmila. They had married the same day he was on duty at fire station number 2 in Pripyat. At 1 a.m., Vasily left for a call. Lyudmila woke up. He was gone. A friend said there was a fire at the station. By morning, he was still missing. Lyudmila went to look for him at the hospital. The firefighters from the first call were there. They were already starting to vomit. One said, "We went up to the roof. There was burning graphite. We started cleaning it up. Then we started vomiting." The people around them didn't understand what was happening. The medical staff was unprepared for a nuclear disaster. They were fed and watered. They didn't know they were beyond help. Meanwhile, Soviet officials were making decisions. First Secretary of the Communist Party of Ukraine, Shcherbitsky, was roused from his bed. Ministers convened for emergency meetings. Information moved up the chain of command with characteristic Soviet slowness. First, understate, embellish, then report. Station Director Viktor Bryukhanov wrote in his first official report to Moscow, "Radiation levels, 3.4 roentgens per hour," when the actual reading in some areas was hundreds and thousands of times higher. Either his dosimeter was also off scale, and he didn't realize he was reading the full scale, or he was deliberately underestimating. Both explanations are equally horrific. The question of immediately evacuating Pripyat was raised on the night of the explosion. The station director, the local party secretary, the fire commanders, each of them understood that something serious had happened. But no one wanted to make a decision that would require an explanation of what this serious thing was and why it had happened. The Soviet system punished independent decisions in emergency situations more severely than delays. So they waited for orders from above. The orders from above waited for information from below. The information from below was understated. The circle was closed. And in this circle, For 26 hours, people died who didn't know they were dying. On the night of April 26th, Deputy Prime Minister Boris Sherbina, a party functionary, not a scientist, arrived in Chernobyl. With him was academician Valery Legasov, a nuclear physicist and deputy director of the Institute of Atomic Energy. It was Legasov, standing in the night before the destroyed reactor, who first saw the full picture of what was happening. He could determine the extent of the disaster from what he saw: the open reactor crater, the incandescent glow, the graphite on the ground. It was Legasov who told Sherbina, "We must evacuate immediately. Not tomorrow, now." Sherbina initially disagreed. The scale was too large, the consequences too many. But the logic of the facts was irresistible. At 4 a.m. on April 27th, the decision to evacuate was made. All that remained was to wait for dawn and the arrival of buses. While officials were investigating, April 26th was proceeding as usual. Lyudmila Ignatenko secured permission to visit her husband. He and other firefighters were being prepared for deployment to Moscow, to the Institute of Biophysics, the only place in the country that knew how to treat acute radiation sickness. Vasily was lying on the bed. Lyudmila took his hand. He said, "Go away. I'm radioactive." She didn't leave. They weren't on the plane to Moscow. They were being transported on a separate flight with the other firefighters. Lyudmila flew alone. She was 28 weeks pregnant. She didn't know that every time she touched Vasily, she was receiving a dose, that the baby in her womb was receiving a dose too. It's the 26th afternoon. Everything looks normal in Pripyat. Lines at the stores, children on swings, fishermen on the Pripyat River, right across from the reactor. No announcements, no warnings. Officially, everything is under control. Some residents experienced a metallic taste in their mouths, a characteristic sign of high radiation. Some noticed a scratchy throat. They assumed it was a virus, an allergy, the spring air. No one connected it with what happened last night. The local newspaper, Tribuna Energetica, was open as usual. Posters for the May Day demonstration hung in the streets. 3 kilometers away, the reactor continued to burn. Helicopters began dropping a mixture of lead, sand, and boron into the crater to suffocate the reaction and reduce emissions. Lead plates, sandbags. The pilots made passes several times a day, each time receiving doses incomparable to anything in civilian aviation. One of the pilots would later say, "We knew it was dangerous. They didn't tell us how dangerous." On the night of 1926, Deputy Prime Minister Boris Sherbina flew to Chernobyl with academician Legasov. It was Legasov, an academician and nuclear physicist, who first saw the full picture, and the first to understand that everything needed to be evacuated immediately. Not in 3 days. Immediately. Legasov would later write in his memoirs, "I experienced something akin to physical horror when I realized what we had done to this city while we were deciding." On the morning of April 27th, the decision was made. Pripyat was to be evacuated. At 14 o'clock, an announcement came over the radio. The announcer read it calmly, without alarm in his voice. Due to an accident at the station. Temporary evacuation. 3 days. Take your documents, money, and essentials. Leave your belongings behind. Return in 3 days. You can pick them up. 3 days. It was precisely these words, 3 days, that remained etched in the memory of everyone who stood at the entrance to their building on April 27, 1986, with a small bag in their hands. 1,100 buses. They were collected from all over Ukraine early in the morning, from collective farms, factories, passenger depots, school garages. By midday on 27th, they stood in a column several kilometers long, from Pripyat to the horizon. The drivers knew only that they were heading into an emergency zone. Many didn't even know that. The announcement was broadcast over the city radio at 1427 on April 27th. The announcer read it in a calm, non-threatening voice, a Soviet tradition: avoid public panic under any circumstances. Due to the accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, an unfavorable radiation situation has developed in the city of Pripyat. Party and Soviet organs, as well as military units, are ensuring the necessary protective measures. However, in order to ensure the complete safety of people, especially children, it is necessary to temporarily evacuate the city's residents. We kindly ask city residents to remain calm, temporarily leave their homes, taking with them documents, essential items, and, for emergency purposes, food. The evacuation will be carried out with the participation of police and City Executive Committee employees. Please take only the bare necessities. Dear comrades, when temporarily leaving your homes, please remember to close windows, turn off electrical and gas appliances, and turn off water taps. Temporary, just in case. Words meant to prevent panic. Words everyone heard and remembered in the meaning they wanted to give them. 3 days, maximum. They'll be back. Over the course of 2 hours, from 1400 to 1600, 1,100 buses evacuated everyone. Children held toys. Women carried bags. Men carried bicycles. Why leave them behind? They were going back anyway. Pensioners lugged heavy suitcases filled with random items, medications, photo albums, apartment deeds. Some locked their doors and pocketed the keys, as if they were planning to return with groceries. Someone left money on the windowsill, so they wouldn't forget. Someone covered their soup with a lid, so it wouldn't get cold. The city was empty by 1600. On April 27, 1986, the only people left in Pripyat were those who hadn't had time or couldn't leave, elderly people who refused, a few people who couldn't be found, and soldiers with dosimeters measuring the background radiation. When the last bus left the city, an officer closed the checkpoint at the entrance. A barrier, a sign, no entry. Thus began the exclusion zone. They never returned. None of the 49,000. Ever. The bread on the tables had gone stale and moldy. The soup on the stoves had evaporated. The milk had turned sour. The cats and dogs that weren't caught ran through the streets and died. Then the military entered the city and shot them, because the animals collected radiation in their fur and could carry it beyond the perimeter. Children's bicycles were left in the courtyards. Swings are still standing. In schools, notebooks with unfinished homework lay on desks. Teachers went to lunch and never returned. The plates in the school cafeteria have been standing there ever since. The amusement park opened. Once, 3 days after the explosion, for PR, to show that everything was fine. Pictures of children on a Ferris wheel, a dosimeter in the photographer's pocket. Then, the park was closed forever. The Ferris wheel still stands, yellow, rusty, in the thicket of birch trees that have grown right through the asphalt over the years. Lyudmila Ignatenko cared for Vasily in a Moscow hospital in 1986. The doctors forbade her to touch him. She did. His skin began to peel. Severe acute radiation sickness destroys cells faster than the body can repair them. Towards the end, she was no longer allowed into the ward without special clothing. She still went in. Vasily Ignatenko died on May 13, 1986, 17 days after the explosion. He was 25 years old. Lyudmila gave birth to their daughter in August. The girl lived for 4 hours. Doctors would later say that her liver absorbed the radiation dose Lyudmila had accumulated while caring for her husband. Academician Legasov lived less than 2 years after Chernobyl. He testified before the IAEA Commission in Vienna, telling the world the truth about what happened for the first time. He returned. He wasn't listened to, as he had hoped. His notes and conclusions about the systemic causes of the disaster were shelved. On April 26, 1988, exactly 2 years after the explosion, he committed suicide. Before his death, he dictated his memoirs onto tapes. They formed the basis for the HBO series Chernobyl, 2019. The exclusion zone, a 30-kilometer radius, villages, towns, farmland. Everything was evacuated. 135,000 people were transported from the zone in the first few days alone. In the following years, another 300,000 were transported from contaminated areas of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. The total number of displaced people, according to various estimates, ranges from 350,000 to 500,000. The number of people who died from the consequences of Chernobyl is still disputed. The WHO puts the figure at around 4,000. Direct deaths from cancer and radiation sickness. Independent studies put the number in the tens of thousands. Chernobyl inflicted damage on territories that now belong to 3 different countries that defies full calculation. Pripyat stands still. A forest of birches and pines grows through the asphalt sidewalks. The trees have grown taller than the roofs of the 5-story buildings. The amusement park, which never opened for normal operations, has become the most photographed place in the zone. Tourists come to see the yellow Ferris wheel. The Luzerny swimming pool remained open until 1996. The liquidators themselves maintained it. In 1986, apples were still growing on the trees in Pripyat in the fall. No one picked them. They fell on their own. They rotted under the trees. No one touched them. Those evacuated with the promise of 3 days received compensation, new housing, and certificates and IDs. But many called Pripyat home for the rest of their lives. Several dozen elderly squatters returned to the zone without permission. Without permission, without documents, without official status. They lived in their own gardens and ate their own chickens. The Soviet and then Ukrainian authorities occasionally pretended to try to evict them, but eventually abandoned them. The last squatter in the zone died quite recently. She lived to be over 90, on radioactive soil, in the house she had been ordered to leave forever 38 years earlier. This is what happened in 36 hours. An explosion at 1 in the morning. Firefighters on burning graphite. Morning in a normal city. A wedding. Children in schools. Fishermen by the river. An invisible cloud over each of the 49,000. Officials who didn't want to create panic. Decisions that were postponed for an hour, and then another. An announcement on the radio at 14 on April 27th. 3 days. 1,100 buses. 2 hours. An empty city. And bread on the tables. Toys in cribs. Documents in drawers. Soup on the stoves that no one ever finished. People who left for 3 days and never returned.